This video touches on topics of child abuse, sexual abuse, institutional abuse, all kinds of abuse really. It contains images of gore and nudity. Please do not watch this video if any of these things make you uncomfortable. I give you these warnings because today we have a very simple question. Why the hell do people love Eddies Gluskin so much? You know, this guy.
Darn. Like all the others. Go! You and the rest of these ungrateful sluts! Did I frighten you? I'm awfully sorry I didn't mean to.
Yeah, that one. The context. So, for the uninitiated, here's a crash course on Mr. Gluskin, and by extension, the universe he belongs to. Eddie here belongs to a game series by the name of Outlast, owned by Red Barrels, and a frankly cheeky game dev crew. And from that series, he belongs to neither of the two main title entries. That's right, the favourite Outlast darling, pun definitely intended, belongs to not a full game release, but a DLC attached to the first game. Arguably, the DLC is a more well-crafted game experience than either of the main titles, but put a pin in that for another time. Now, what is Outlast? I hear absolutely none of the 5 of you watching this saying. Well, dear viewer, I'm so glad you asked, and that I didn't write that into the script at all. Outlast is a first-person survival horror game released back in the year of our Lord and Saviour, 2013, which means this is totally still relevant, and I'm not late to this conversation at all. It could be worse. Huh. Well, okay then. Carry on. So, ignoring the amalgamation of meh that is the sequel, the Outlast games revolve around a very honest, very trustworthy, definitely here to be your friend Umbrella Corporation, the Murkoff Corporation. And to verify this very trustworthy corporation's very friendly intentions, one Miles Upshur travels up to Mount Massive Asylum, and surprisingly in all of his self-written memos, doesn't breach the topic of the questionable naming choices Murkoff made. Mount Massive, really? Mount Massive! Anyway, you see, Mr. Upshur here is a reporter, and so it is his God-given duty to investigate any newsworthy topic, even if that includes breaking into a mental institution, ignoring warnings from a dying squad member, picking himself up after being hurled out of the window by the world's burliest baby, getting drugged by God's right-hand man who isn't having any of this in his good Christian Minecraft server, having his liver sized up by 2 naked twins, pointing his camera directly at their dick, running for his life, more running for his life, meeting a friendly doctor, getting an unapproved surgery that he does not have the health insurance for, losing his new best buddy in the elevator, more running for his life, choosing not to scale the very obvious ways out, setting things on fire, more elevators, Oldman Freeman giving him chores with pocket money, a little dash of murder for good measure, making friends with a Robo-Ghost, and then finally going to get his pocket money for a job well done and having Old Man Freeman stiff him. But it's okay, Robo-Ghost has him covered. And that's Outlast. So I know what you're thinking, but Mal, where is this elusive Gluskin character you named this video after? Oh, my sweet summer child, he's busy getting his bride prepared for the wedding.
I've looked all over, but no girlie cannot find who seems to be
So let's talk about it. The DLC. Our introduction to Mr. Gluskin is actually not as a villain, but as a victim. The first time we encounter Gluskin is after our resident good boy, Waylon, has just gotten done trying to rat out the Murkoff Corporation and Miles. Thanks for that, Waylon. Miles' 2 missing fingers are so grateful for that. We see Gluskin being pulled into one of the many experiments which are totally human rights approved, and our introduction to the situation is him begging us for help, which we promptly do not give him.
I know you can stop this. You have to help me. You have.
Hey, calm yourself. This is a high security.
It's all right, Agent. Mr. Hart was just surprised.
This is out of no cruelty on the part of the player or Waylon, but just an extension of our own helplessness in the asylum, unable to help ourselves or anyone else.
I'm sure he's still calm and eager to finish his work. Take your seat.
Besides, Waylon has his own problems in the form of getting a formal write-up from my favourite corporate douchebag.
Somebody's been telling stories outside of class.
On the floor.
Who is totally underutilized and not nearly beloved enough by the fandom that puts this cheesecake
Darn.
the damn pedestal. Welcome to my TED Talk about why Jeremy Blair deserves more attention! Right. Put a pin in it for another day. After a dose of workplace hostility and some straight up unapologetic ear molestation,
What's the matter? Somebody hit you?
Waylon begins his journey through the asylum once the riots break out. His experience is very similar to that of Miles. Just swap out Little Piggy for Cannibal Holocaust over there, and the definitely qualified and board-approved doctor for the main man of this video, Gluskin. The build-up to Gluskin throughout the game is pretty subtle, and you would entirely miss it if you didn't read every bit of scrap paper the workers left behind, and got lucky enough to spot him a few times lurking in the dark along the way. After our initial encounter with Gluskin at the beginning of the game, pleading for help, we don't physically run into him again for the first half of the game, referred to mostly by aliases like the Groom, the Man Downstairs, and most ominously, the Thing Below. Ooh, I like that one. And then once Waylon does finally stumble across his lair thanks to a family of one dropping his ass into the Groom's domain, this dapper chap just wants to have a good, wholesome chat.
Let me feel you. You don't have to be alone anymore. You could make them whole. I could feel that emptiness inside you.
Or not. Once inside of Gluskin's area, Waylon is subjected to a myriad of questionable art pieces that I just know my professors would have graded more highly than my animations. I'm not bitter. A couple of live, laugh, love style motivational slogans on the walls, more nudity than anyone would like, some folksy singing, and of course, commitment avoiding. Even if Waylon hadn't been a father of two and happily married to a certified boss bitch, whose only canonical references within the game revolve around cussing out business boy Blair, love you Lisa, Gluskin still probably wouldn't have gotten that far with his courting efforts, on account of his fascination with genital mutilation. You're not certified, Gluskin, at least ask a doctor for help. Damn. At this point, the game becomes solely focused on avoiding Gluskin's extreme idea of a first date, and asking to at least sign a prenup about who gets to do what with your junk. Spoiler alert, he won't sign it. After a whole lot of running, jumping, falling, nightmares, and a newfound respect for civil divorce, Waylon eventually escapes from Gluskin with a rather guttural end for the Groom. Now, knowing all of that, we can talk about Gluskin himself for a moment, who he is and how he came to be the asylum's most perpetually divorced bachelor. Gluskin is a character that falls into two very distinct categories that often come hand in hand with games like Outlast: a tragic victim and a violent abuser. Gluskin, women, sexuality, and trauma. See, here's the thing about Gluskin. Before his time in the asylum and exposure to the experiments that drove him completely off the deep end, he was a convicted serial killer, having killed and mutilated several women. This little tidbit of information is, at best, glossed over or entirely forgotten by the fandom at times. Before the extensive exposure to the Wall Rider program, Gluskin had already suffered from a small laundry list of mental conditions. He suffers from psychotic delusions, PTSD, and could be labelled with a number of antisocial personality disorders. In the game's lore, Gluskin is shown to be deceptive, before being sent entirely insane in that special Murkoff brand way. Not so much in the manipulative and cunning sense of the word, but when he lies, it comes across more as desperate. Many of his lies can be chalked up to his own attempts to repress his childhood. See, as a child, Gluskin was abused by both his father and his uncle, sexually and physically. This information is given to us rather clinically by the game and occasionally in snippets of dialogue from Gluskin. When presented with the fact of his crimes and the abuse he suffered at the hands of his uncle and father, Gluskin outright denies the reality of it. Instead of dead, mutilated women, he claims that they're peacefully sleeping, and when faced with the dark past he had, Gluskin instead paints a picturesque image of how he was raised, using an old sitcom to fill in his backstory rather than acknowledge what actually happened to him. These lies were designed purely for his own consumption, and it's up to the player to decide exactly how far gone Eddie was before the engine program sent him from simply going off the deep end into the Mariana Trench. He does occasionally have moments of lucidity both before and after the asylum scrambled his brains into a fine paste. These moments typically came with explosive anger and screaming. It's noted in his patient file when talking about his past that Gluskin would laugh or fly into a rage when faced with images of his father and uncle. It would not be a stretch to say these outbursts are characterized by Gluskin feeling so threatened or so out of his depth that his survival instinct have kicked back in, and that's why he lashes out. When thinking about Gluskin through the lens of a victim, the words, "When I confronted him with the photographs his father and uncle took, he responded with a mixture of laughter and anger, and restraints were issued," becomes quite tragic. And it is this feeling of empathy towards the character that I argue pushes him to the position of Outlast darling, even more so than his frankly too finely sculpted chest. Look at those arms in that vest. Majestic. Fanfiction and the fandom. Now that you have your certification in Gluskin lore, we can get back to the core question of this video. Why the fandom went absolutely nuts for this beefcake? So, I like fanfiction. I write it, I read it, I just plain like it. The discussion of fanfiction and its influence on media and fiction is a whole ass video in and of itself, and we'll put a pin in that for another day. Can't carry all these pins, damn. For those of you who peruse Archive of Our Own, or fanfiction.net, or the other one that we don't talk about, like The Forgotten Middle Child, you may have noticed the popularity of gay ships in fanfiction above heterosexual relationships, and even their lesbian counterparts. Again, there's a whole other essay in my mind for that particular trend, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. For a more in-depth video on this phenomenon, I would recommend Sarah Z's video essay on the matter, focusing on homosexual relationships in fanfiction and their prevalence. Link can be found below. But for our main man Gluskin, the reason this is notable is because of all the characters Outlast that have been written about on Archive and fanfiction, Gluskin is the one that appears in stories most frequently and the most dominantly, outranking every other Outlast character in the series by a large margin, with the narrow exclusion of a single main character from the trio of protagonists and his most commonly paired love interest. That love interest? This lucky guy right here.
Oh God! Oh God, look at it! Tell me you wrote that!
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's right. Nothing screams true love like trying to cut off your man's dick on the first date. Can I say that on YouTube? Well, the words came out of my mouth, so I guess we're going with it. And this lovely couple is typically paired together romantically in two different ways: the alternate reality and the canon bending. Technically all fanfiction is an AU of some form or another because it diverts in some way from the source material, but for this video we're just making the distinctions between the two most common types of fan content you'll find out there. In canon bending, which I'm sure has a real term but I don't know it and I'm not going to look for it, includes taking events that happen in-game and changing small elements. For example, what would happen if Wayland played Happy Families with Gluskin? Would he keep his pecker? This is a very common trope covered in Outlast fanfiction to varying degrees of gross and interesting. The rate of pecker keeping is about 50-50. Put a pin in it because we'll come back to this trope in just a little bit. And then there's the AU, where the author takes these two lovebirds and slaps them into a totally different world. Think coffee shop AUs, high school days, there was only one bed, that type of AU. Of the two paths, AUs are what I would argue the more palatable stories, as authors feel free to kick all the dick mutilation, horrible misogynistic murder sprees off to the side, and only keep the parts they like. Specifically, that vest! But even in these stories, if they remain even remotely true to Gluskin as a character, he retains elements of abuse, stalker tendencies, manipulation, and yeah, the misogyny creeps back on in. Think your Christian Greys of the world. It's funny I should bring that up, or put a pin in it for later. And just generally exhibiting behaviour that in the real world would be very unsexy, but is extremely common and desirable in the written world. And you see, that's just the thing about a lot of this. The words, "in real life, this would be horrible," are kind of pointless. Of course Gluskin would be horrible in real life. Of course, if any of these things were to play out in real life, it would be horrible. But they don't. They happen under the author's fingertips, safe wish fulfillment. And in that, I find no fault. Fantasy is just that. Fantasy. If you want to write a fantastical story where Gluskin is suddenly working in a bridal shop and sweeps a not-married Wayland off his feet, more power to you. You want to write a dark, gritty love story where Gluskin's horrible deeds are left on display as you and Wayland slug through hell and back to either escape or save Gluskin? Go off, queen. You get that wish fulfillment. But here's the kicker, the real boot to the balls. Sometimes, just sometimes, it really seems like the fantasy part is a little bit forgotten. And that's the point where I finally started to get a little bit fired up to write a, what are we at now? 3,000 word essay. And climbing. Yep. So when does fanfiction go from just some cringy fun wish fulfillment to problematic? I'm making ear bunny quotes, you can't see that, but I am. And can it even reach that point at all? Enter stage left, the fanfiction to be well. A quick disclaimer before moving forward. I am only going to name drop and include links to content I address directly, and I'm only going to directly address content I have something positive to say about. Why? Because, generalized a statement as this is, fanfiction in this vein is often written by very young or inexperienced writers, and anything problematic or just plain poorly written is part of their growth, and I am not here to put them on blast. I was exactly the same when I started writing fanfiction, and even now, I'm no Stephen King or Shakespeare. I'm not here to name and shame or at anyone. Call me a coward in the comments if you like, but that's how I'm running this damn TED Talk. Keeping that in mind, allow me to express my frustration with stories surrounding Gluskin and Wayland. Those that don't make use of the coffee shop AU approach and stick to the asylum storyline have a tricky road to walk. It requires a lot of tweaking and mental backflips to be able to make Gluskin's horrors fit into a romantic mold without just coming across as plainly abhorrent. Some authors don't even make these backflips. These are the dark stories. Often short one-offs that study the characters and situation without pushing the idea of this being a good romantic pairing. These stories run closer to essays than they do wish fulfillment fantasies, and personally, I like these an awful lot. Even if they have a nasty habit of sometimes leaving you feeling like they scooped out your insides and left you empty. Thanks, guys. However, a majority of fics of this nature follow the what if Waylon played along path, and they vary in quality from there. In some cases, Waylon instantly falls for his would-be mutilator, and the keeping of genitals is optional at that point. In other cases, Waylon slowly descends into Stockholm Syndrome. All of these are obviously horrible things to happen, but it all comes down to framing. The value of the story of Waylon Park being abused and mutilated is one that comes down to the writer's tone and belief that what is happening in the story is a romance or a tragedy or both. The writer who details the horrors of Waylon's suffering is very different from the writer that details how handsome Gluskin is while he cuts off Waylon's little Johnny and how much of a gay mess Waylon is while being mutilated. This is uncomfortable romanticization of extreme abuse and violence, and it's not only found in the canon bend. I've given AUs a bit of a free pass here, but a little fun fact, the most abhorrent and my least favourite fanfiction of all time, Gluskin-centric or otherwise, is an AU. As I mentioned before, I won't be naming names, but allow me to express my extreme disgust in reading a story of Gluskin killing and maiming people around Waylon, and Waylon swooning over him with no regard for all those dead friends or his own abuse. Even when Waylon could have been caught and stopped, Waylon decides to protect him, accuse his remaining not murdered friends of being jealous of their love, and attacking his sexy, mysterious murder man that is also out to kill Waylon himself. Needless to say, I am still seething over this story. It is one of the things that pushed me to make this video. Now allow me to clarify. There is nothing wrong with writing broken characters with broken thoughts and actions that we know to be detrimental to themselves and others. That is just drama. A clear example of this would be from the fan story Follow the Blood. This is my all-time favourite Outlast fan story, and like a majority of the content around Outlast, it features abuse, mutilation, mental health, sexual assault, and everything else that comes wrapped up in the Outlast name. And while this story does include ships, Waylon and Gluskin are not the focus. Almost all of the original Outlast cast get a chapter at least, and this exposes the story to a bit of a wider range of dark and horrific delights. The inclusion and focus of these topics is not the problem. So why do I give a dark story like this a pass, but come down harder on that unnamed Gluskin fic that I railed on earlier? Well, it comes back to framing. The problem comes with the intent of the author and the message they send with their writing. If the story says, sure, Gluskin just killed Waylon's whole family and stabbed him multiple times, but he's just so sexy and misunderstood, and that those same authors will occasionally lash out and fight tooth and nail to protect their sexy Gluskin image, then we have a problem. So, with all of that said, let's move on to talk about the other side of the spectrum with the fanfiction, To Be Well. So a bit of context, I only found out about this story this year when my friend told me about it. I was surprised when she told me that it had not just been released, but instead had actually returned from the Banished Lands. This is all word of mouth, so please take it with a grain of salt, but from my understanding of what happened to this fanfiction, it was originally started all the way back in 2014, and it was taken down not long after when the author received lots of negative attention for their depiction of mental health in the story, and the characters being considered OOC, or out of character. A quick synopsis of the fanfiction is as such. The events of Outlast have taken place almost exactly as they transpired through the game, with a small change of Gluskin not dying via impalement, and instead being placed into a proper psychiatric hospital where Waylon Park is also eventually seeking help. I noticed actually that pretty much everyone from Outlast survived, except for Blair. Thank you very much! Why does no one love my baby? Anyway, sorry. From there the two meet, both battling with their own trauma and demons as they try to find a way to mend the damage that they have done and that has been done to them, while also figuring out how they feel about one another. Gayness ensues. Now, while not a flawless work, no work really is, To Be Well had a take on Gluskin and Waylon that I hadn't come across until that point. There is a particularly visceral moment where Gluskin explains to a still traumatized Waylon that there is nothing he could have done to spare himself what happened in the asylum. Waylon had more or less been playing out the fantasy in his head of the most popular canon-bending path in Outlast fanfiction, the what-if of playing happy families with Gluskin. He'd been using it as a means to cope with what happened to him and return some sense of power to himself. However, when speaking with Gluskin, he was disillusioned. And this story took that trope and snapped it over its knee like Bane broke Batman's spine. For me, having read so many variations of this canon-bending trope, this single reality check from Gluskin was amazingly refreshing and far more realistic. However, because thus far everything has been my own speculation, I thought it would only be right to reach out to the author of To Be Well themselves to get their thoughts on what happened. So I've sent them an email and they were kind enough to get back to me. After speaking with them over many an essay-length email and getting a few interview questions kindly answered for me, I had a lot to think about. So much to think about. Oh my god. Now, after their experience with backlash and harassment, Tenuous has asked me not to quote them directly or share the interview in this video. I am going to respect that and keep our conversations private, just using them as a means of informing my own thoughts going forward. I have my own thoughts and feelings on why people may have lashed out based on my own experience when reading the story. But for this section, I'm going to talk specifically about the topics that cropped up in my emails with Tenuous. The most notable topic that we touched on was using writing as a means of coping and processing complex emotion and fears. I've talked about this a little bit already, but speaking with Tenuous gave me more to think about with a different, personal experience to my own. You see, often when we think about writing stories as a response to abusers, there is a trend of revenge and power fantasy fulfillment stories. Slightly off topic, but you find stories written by people who have not experienced abuse as a woman have a rather unpleasant trend of having their female badass characters only becoming strong badasses after being subjected to extreme sexual violence. They then carry out the revenge fantasy of butchering all their abusers. Think Kill Bill, etc. This is a very common response to abusers. A less commonly thought of response to the same subject material is the I can change him fantasy. This is usually thought of as a much softer form of coping mechanism, although it most often crops up in romance stories. Think your Mills and Boon or Bosom Heaver romance novels, where the I can change him aspect usually revolves around the man being an aloof, narcissistic prick, typically fairly emotionally or financially abusive, but not often physically. In the case of villain characters in fanfiction, well, it's a bit more of a dramatic change. For Gluskin, the I can change him is quite extreme. We're talking taking a deranged serial killer and filing him down to a soft puppy and or sex god that is full of repentance. That is no easy task and it can be easily mishandled. Allow me to clarify. There is nothing wrong with this approach to wish fulfillment and storytelling, yet this approach tends to attract harsher judgment than other revenge and power fantasies, which are often just as, if not far more exploitive of the characters, female characters in particular. But the I can change him fantasy often gets a lot of flack for being unrealistic and a very feminine approach to the situation. And you'll find that things viewed as feminine in media are simultaneously viewed as shallow or vapid. Think of the response to overly feminine characters, makeup, fashion, ponies and mermaids, anything remotely targeted at a teenage girl, and even a whole-ass colour, for God's sake. Femininity in media is not treated kindly, and this type of coping fantasy is branded in a similar fashion. For a deeper discussion on this topic, I'd highly recommend Lindsey Ellis' video, Dear Stephenie Myer. And I swear to God, this is a good segue into our next talking point, and I'm not just running out of time and sanity to get to it, the I'm not like other girls effect. Let me begin by apologising for how central this has become to people of the female variety, but there is a reason for this. By and large, fanfiction is written by women. There is a whole other TED talk in there about the social causes behind this trend and how we got to this point, but for right now, it's just important context for us to have. Because as a broad generalisation, the people writing these love stories for Eddie Dearest tend to be young women. And Gluskin is a notorious misogynist. Why would people of my own ilk find attraction in this nightmare in motion? The vest? It's probably the vest. I think we've established that's a real damn fine vest. Wonderful. Now for the two people out there who haven't heard of the I'm not like other girls phenomenon, allow me to summarise. Pink bad, goth good. Pretty bad, books good. Makeup and parties bad, pizza and Netflix good. The other girls, me. This is the I'm not like other girls, and she is almost the female equivalent of a nice guy. Henceforth, she shall be referred to as an in-log. And for a bit more insight on this phenomenon, you can go to... Wait. Sarah Z again? What? Wait, she released this video after I finished scripting? What? Girl, you're just on point with these videos lately. Damn, let me get this script out before you make another video. Anyway, yeah, Sarah Z made a video on this phenomenon, and I'll link it below if you'd like to learn more. At this rate, the description box is just going to be linked to her videos. But for our video, we're going to focus on two elements of the in-log, specifically the internalized misogyny behind it. Yes, I am using that term. I don't care if it makes you feel icky hearing the words internalized misogyny. Don't bother adding me, I do not care. And the outward hostility towards the perceived other girls. In the context of Outlast and Gluskin in particular, the other girls are characterized as people who like Gluskin when he's softened and saved in some way. usually partaking in the I can change in fantasy, or bypassing the whole conversation around Gluskin's sordid past and more recent crimes entirely in favour of indulging in the fluff and the smut. While the alpha in-logs are people who insist Gluskin come warts, deformities, misogyny, mass murder and all. The argument usually boils down to which approach to the man is more valid and shunning the other party. As a generalization, the shunning tends to be more so directed towards the other girl from the in-log. These are two people who like the same character, perhaps for different traits, but the focus of their affection is the same character. So why is there such hostility between people who enjoy the same things? There's a lot behind the mentality that fuels the I'm not like other girls phenomenon, and it would be disingenuous to say that it stems from the same source for all people expressing this mentality. However, I think that there are some strong universal trends found with N-logs that we can highlight. A strong component that contributes to this mentality is insecurity as well as a certain level of shame. There is a strong need for validation, and some would argue from men in particular. And while this may be true in some cases, validation from society as a whole is likely more important to the in-log as a general rule. As mentioned earlier, society at large has a real hate boner for girly things. Like, seriously, the level of disdain and ridicule thrown at entertainment directed towards young girls is frankly mind-boggling when compared to that of young boys. The words, "you're not like the other girls," has been a compliment for centuries, and to this day is considered a compliment in romance media. It's a real slap in the face to the gender, honestly. So, understandably, there's a drive for young women to separate themselves from the dreaded other girls, and thus begins the active hatred and dismissal of those girly things. Like romance novels, clothing, socializing, an entire colour, a fact I will never get over and never stop groaning about. It's our colour, guys! What are you even doing? Anyway. But in this case, it's a horror game with a focus on a serial killer. One of these things is not like the others. So, what is an N-log to do when faced with a character like Gluskin that they enjoy? How do they assert that they are still not all hard eyes like the other girls? Well, in comes the usual distancing. These two people both like Gluskin, but the in-log seeks to distance themselves from the other girls, and in their efforts to do so can become judgmental and aggressive, accusing others of romanticizing abuse or falling for Gluskin's bullshit, going so far as to say those other girls deserve to be abused because of that. A strange thing to say when their focus is on how they acknowledge how bad Gluskin is, implying that they know these things are awful but still wish them onto other girls regardless. Classy. This type of harassment is actually what happened to Tenuous, who kindly supplied me with an example of the types of messages they got. And before you ask, no, we are not going to talk in depth about the mental illness component of all this today, because this video is already stupid long and it is a topic that requires more than a throwaway paragraph. Moving on. Tenuous was marked as the other in this situation, for their approach to Gluskin and Wayland's relationship. As a result, they got hit with this level of disdain as the in-logs attempted to elevate themselves above the other in this scenario. My hot take. Right, now that we've gone through that, all of that, we can finally get to my hot take on why To Be Well got such backlash. Don't get me wrong, there's lots of personal, individual reasons for other people, as well as Tenuous' own thoughts on what caused the backlash, but here's mine to add to the pile. Think back to that scene I mentioned earlier, where Gluskin and Wayland sit down early on in the story and talk openly for the first time about what happened in the asylum, and Gluskin says no. He says no to the what if of Wayland playing along with his delusions, and says that such an idea would simply never work and he would have died. It was not intended to be so, but this scene to me still has the Batman spine-breaking effect to the fandom's love of that particular story trope. And this is where my own speculation comes in. But I think it is this moment and moments like these that caused To Be Well to garner such ire. Outlast is a game and a fandom rife with horrible and dark themes, and it is no place to learn about good mental health or healthy relationships. It is a place for exploring dark ideas and a good jump scare, not to educate people on the dangers of untreated mental health and institutional or domestic abuse. And there are droves of fan stories and art that revel in these horrible ideas that, by and large, are not given a second glance, regardless of how problematic they may or may not be. Yet, To Be Well, a story that allowed Gluskin to not only take responsibility for his atrocities, but had him well and truly hold a mirror to himself, was the one that got chased off the internet for a few years. Why is that? Well, I think it's because the mirror he held to himself got turned on to the audience as well. It's no fun to feel like you're getting called out for excusing a serial killer or a misogynist. It's no fun to be told that the fantasy of you'll be his special case, the one he loves instead of stabs, is grossly unrealistic. It is no fun to have the usual Gluskin trope of what if Wayland played along to get dismantled in just a few seconds after you've enjoyed that trope for so long. And it's no fun to question that if what you're doing and if your affection for a character is problematic. That can really fuck you up when you're taken off guard by it. And then people become defensive, and out comes the hostility, not realizing that there was never any accusation there to begin with. It's just another way to enjoy and explore a fun character, but once emotions get wrapped up in everything and defenses raise, people begin to lash out. I believe this is what happened in the case of To Be Well. Again, these are all just my thoughts on the situation, and to be honest, I could be completely wrong. And even if I am, I still think it's an important thing to give a bit of thought to. If you want to write your story about Gluskin being a mysterious, sexy man of the night that gets the girl, or the Wayland, despite the abuse and non-consensual loving that happens on the way, well, that's okay, so long as you, the author or the reader, recognize it for what it is, a bit of trashy wish fulfillment. In the real world, that would never fly, and I'm pretty sure 95% of people already know that perfectly well. Having Gluskin being an irredeemable character is not inherently a bad thing. It causes narrative tension and keeps the story juicy for the reader. It's when people start defending this fantasy and the mentality of Gluskin is just a victim, or it's okay, there was a bit of bad stuff but he really loves Wayland in earnest, that we're crossing some lines. Then it crosses the line and jumps ship entirely when people start to lash out and attack creators for their approach to Gluskin. Be it for falling for his bullshit or any other ridiculous justifications popping into someone's head when they go ahead and tell someone else they should be physically assaulted for writing a bit of wish fulfillment. In essence, these are two extremes, and neither one is great to fall into, but without a doubt the one where people start hurling threats, insults, and accusations is the worst of them. So after all this rambling nonsense, what can you take away from this video? Well, I can't say we fully answered the original question as to why Gluskin is such a stud in the fandom. I can speculate the different reasons why Gluskin is so appealing to players. As a character, he is fascinating, his voice acting is enthralling, his brand of insanity is as frightening as it is entertaining, his section in the Outlast games is arguably the best sequence in all of the series, and of course, there is that vest. He's also a victim, and typically we feel for people that experience the sort of suffering and neglect that Gluskin did. As a child who was abused to the adult that was made into a guinea pig by Murkoff, it's hard not to empathize with him. And sometimes people just want a good monster to enjoy. Be it to experience fear safely through a monitor with the ability to opt out whenever they please as the ultimate safe word, or to enjoy a good, heavy, smutty story with no strings attached and whatever kink they want slapped over top. Or just to indulge the redemption fantasy with some feelings at the end. In short, there's many reasons to like Gluskin, and none of them are wrong. There's nothing wrong with liking horrific characters, nor is there anything wrong with writing stories for them. But when the story for that character runs in the vein of ignoring or downplaying their actions, or people start getting aggressive, then problems arise. When people begin to feel defensive or ashamed of their enjoyment of a character and seek to validate themselves by attacking others for the way in which they enjoy the same material, then we have a problem. I promise you, I really truly promise you that if you like a villain, you should be free to like them without needing to make excuses or twisting their actions. There is no harm in seeing a guy in a really fine vest coming to absolutely ruin your shit in a video game and thinking, that's hot, I want that. Or simply empathizing with him. There is no harm in any of it. Feel free to take him as he is, horrible crimes and all. Do not excuse, just enjoy, and most importantly, do not harass those that prefer him not to take him as he is. Let them enjoy Gluskin for what he could be in their world, for what a character like him might mean to them. Let them enjoy him the same way you do without getting up on a damn high horse about it. If you see him and think, hot, and someone else sees him and thinks, what if? That's just more ways to love the same scary bastard man. It's all just fantasy after all.
Neither ain't chase you, babe.
Right, okay, yikes, this got long, but I think it's done now, like, really done. Wow, okay, time to edit this beast, I guess. Fun fact about me, my favourite Outlast character is Traeger, and the runner-up is Bitch Boy Blair over there. Yeah, I like the corporate rat man, come at me. Sorry, Gluskin, you're like a strong 5th favorite character, right after Lisa and Miles. You and Wayland can, like, share 5th place. With that, I'm done.